There are many secrets in Putin's life. Some of them we know, some we don't yet, and there are some we are unlikely to ever learn even after his death. But there is one main secret that in fact many people know, while others simply don't want to believe it because the truth is just too horrifying. This secret is the circumstance of how the future unifier of Russian lands came to power. More precisely, it's the apartment bombings in the fall of 1999 which actually became the starting point for the rise of the former KGB colonel to the Kremlin throne. That's why today we'll talk about the most grandiose provocation organized by the Russian special services in order to ensure the unhindered rise to power of their protege. The most objective, balanced analysis of those events. I'm Semyon, this is Mega Show Television, and we're starting. August 99. Although the explosions occurred in September 1999, we need to look at least a month earlier to better understand the context. It was then, in August 1999, that the processes began, which all of humanity is still dealing with to this day. In one of my previous videos, I talked about why and under what circumstances Yeltsin's circle chose Putin as the most optimal successor. Thus, the Successor operation was launched, and it seemed that everything in this operation had been thoroughly thought out. The frail and feeble Yeltsin, who was hated by almost the entire population of Russia, publicly handed over power to a relatively young and untainted official, a grey, boring bureaucrat. A Brezhnev-type figure, who by and large was nothing special, and therefore was supposed to be an easily controlled figure. And upon coming to power, he was supposed to guarantee immunity for Yeltsin and his family, as well as the billions in assets they had acquired with such difficulty. That's exactly what Putin was by August of 1999, an utterly ordinary manager, of which there were plenty in Yeltsin's inner circle. Among the general public, almost no one knew anything about him, especially since he headed the country's most secretive agency, the Federal Security Service. And then suddenly it was like a bolt from the blue. On August 9th, among the general public, Yeltsin appoints him as acting prime minister and immediately in a televised address officially names him as his successor. A week later, the State Duma approves his appointment by majority vote. Thus, in Russia, bypassing all constitutional norms, a true crown prince appeared. Only unlike the monarchies of old, where the heir to the throne was prepared from a young age to rule the state. Putin was not prepared for ruling by anyone, and his candidacy, as I already mentioned, was the result of various intrigues and games of thrones. What does it take to win? However, there was one very important gap in the plans of the Russian elite. To become a full-fledged Tsar, the crown prince had to go through a small formality: elections. After all, the president is a product of the will and expression of the majority of the adult population, not of oligarchs and ministers. Therefore, the choice of Yeltsin's henchmen had to be confirmed by voting. And there were serious problems with that. Unlike modern elections in Russia, where the winner is known even before the candidates start moving, in the late 90s the situation was completely different, hard to predict. The previous decade was characterized by at least relative freedom of speech and democracy. It's hard to believe that today. But for a short time, Russia was a democratic state with numerous problems: corruption, the rise of oligarchs, and in general, a politically immature population that was easily swayed by various schemes, election tricks, and manipulations. In other words, democracy was immature, not yet fully established on Russian soil, but still democracy is democracy, and it could have put an end to the plans of those in power at the time. They were seriously afraid that if Putin's candidacy was put to a nationwide vote, he could easily have lost to more experienced politicians, such as Grigory Yavlinsky, Boris Nemtsov, or even the perennial communist Gennady Zhuganov. And if they were to hold pre-election debates, then it would be a total disaster. A reserved and sullen person, a typical introvert who could only answer by reading from a script, would hardly appeal to the public. Politicians who are used to parliamentary debates would easily wipe the floor with him. It's no wonder that even during his studies at the KGB higher school, Vladimir Vladimirovich was found completely unfit for agent work, since he lacked the ability to recruit new agents. And as for possible falsification of voting results, even the corrupt Yeltsin administration couldn't have fabricated high numbers for a person whom the voters simply didn't know. Everyone who had any involvement in the elections understands perfectly well that you can only add maybe a couple of percent, 5 at most, otherwise it would be too obvious. Yanukovych once added more than 10% for himself and ended up with the Orange Revolution. But let's get back to our topic. In the situation that had developed, there was only one way out. It was necessary to boost Putin's ratings so much that no election could threaten him, and the great imperial crown would end up in the right hands. But how to achieve this is a very tricky question. In 1999, they could have followed Ukraine's example and given buckwheat to voters. Is that a good option? I think many people remember those times when candidates for high positions engaged in simple voter bribery. A kilo of buckwheat pasta, a bottle of oil, a can of sunflower oil, condensed milk, a couple of cans of canned fish, and if you're lucky, some stew too. A standard food package, and your vote is in their pocket. But seriously, they could slightly increase pensions, scholarships, or raise social benefits. Just a little, of course, but accompany the increase with promises that things will get even better in the future. A standard picture, isn't it? It's no coincidence Ukraine's second president Leonid Kuchma called his memoirs "Ukraine is not Russia." But the principle works the other way around as well. Russia is not Ukraine either. And the Ukrainian methods of achieving victory in elections, to put it mildly, were not entirely acceptable. First of all, this requires additional resources, and secondly, it could have been done without them. Only instead of buckwheat, you can use human lives and the fear of losing them. A win-win option. They pulled the Chechen card out of their sleeve. So what decision was made? First of all, it's necessary to create an atmosphere of severe, total fear in Russian society. It's much easier to manipulate people who are scared. They will always follow the one who shows them the right path. Secondly, a noble knight savior appears on a white horse or a white Mercedes, it doesn't really matter. And thirdly, the grateful people unanimously vote in the elections for the freedom brought by their liberator. And he solemnly enters the Grand Kremlin Palace and settles there forever. That's how it is, simple and beautiful. In this whole scheme, the most difficult part was the first point, how to create this atmosphere of fear. World historical experience predicts only two obvious options, either through war or through terror. Putin's Chekist entourage decided to act both ways, and that's when they remembered Chechnya. Chechnya had long troubled Federal Security Service officers, army generals, and those who believed in Mother Russia's imperial greatness, while denying people's right to self-determination. Due to the First Chechen War, the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria became effectively independent, though no country recognized its sovereignty. I won't cover the Chechen War's history here. I have a separate video on my channel about it. I'll just say that many among the Russian leadership dreamed of revenge and returning Chechnya under their control, and Putin himself perfectly embodied all these aspirations. A former KGB officer, director of the Federal Security Service, dreaming of the revival of the greatness of the Russian state and restoring it as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics Empire 2.0. And also, in this whole scheme, the Federal Security Service played a key role. The KGB generals had dreamed since Soviet times that one of their own would take the throne, thereby increasing their influence in the state. And they wouldn't have to share power with some bureaucrats from the Yeltsin family, or even worse, with the hated oligarchs. For Federal Security Service officers then, the ideal was all power concentrated with security services. And looking ahead, it can be noted that Putin did not disappoint them. For a quarter of a century now, Russia has been diligently and purposefully plundered by a Chekist mafia group that only knows how to divide and take away, but is completely incapable of multiplying or producing anything useful, except for weapons. Let's get down to business. First, it was necessary to organize the Second Chechen War in such a way that the Chechens would attack first, so that Moscow would appear to be the defending side, and this was achieved. Militants from among the most radical Islamists, who were called Wahhabis, attacked the neighboring Russian Republic of Dagestan to further spread the banner of jihad, and in retaliation, Moscow declared a counter-terrorist operation. That's how a new war began in the Caucasus. At first glance, everything appears correct and legal. Terrorists attack, brave soldiers liberate, just like in any normal civilized country. But there's something odd about the date. The militants attacked on August 7, 1999. And 2 days later, Putin becomes Yeltsin's successor. As they say, coincidence? I don't think so. The invasion of Dagestan may have been orchestrated by Russian special services using Wahhabi militants, with many Federal Security Service agents in the Islamic Committee's leadership. Staging a provocation was easily manageable. Then, under the strong, courageous leadership of Prime Minister Vladimir Vladimirovich to liberate Dagestan from the enemy, it creates a perfect picture. You create the problem yourself and then solve it yourself, just in the spirit of Chekist special operations. And to complete the picture, you need to add a couple of finishing touches. Creating this kind of provocation was completely in line with the traditions of the Vashke, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, and KGB. Just remember the murder of Sergei Kirov in 1934, which Stalin used as a pretext to start mass repressions. And as for Russian agents among the leaders of Chechnya, a vivid example is the father of the current loyal foot soldier of Putin, Don Ramzan Kadyrov. Akhmat Kadyrov was the Mufti of Chechnya, a role similar to a metropolitan in Orthodoxy during the First Chechen War. He advocated fighting against the infidel dogs, well, as he called them then, Russians, and young Ramzanchik was proud that he killed his first Russian at the age of 16. But as soon as the Second Chechen War began, Kadyrov Sr. immediately switched to the Russian side. A logical question arises: how did he manage to change sides so quickly? The answer is simple. He had long been maintaining ties with Moscow, working with the Federal Security Service, making deals and bargaining for himself and his clan. The best spot under the sun, and he wasn't alone. The explosions and what followed them? By early September, most Wahhabis were expelled from Dagestan, with the area fully cleared by September 14 Talis. The Russian leadership naturally faced a question: should they be satisfied with their achievements or advance further into Chechnya? In that case, it would seriously escalate the war and greatly increase the conflict. It would also mean a direct violation of the Khasavyurt agreements of 1996, which ended the First Chechen War. Most importantly, Olyando Olof Putinsky was most worried about public opinion. Yes, there was a time when it wasn't society adapting to Putin, but Putin adapting to its demands. Alas, those bright days are long gone. It was no secret to anyone in power that the overwhelming majority of Russians were against a new war with Chechnya. Clearing Dagestan of Islamists is one thing, but invading Chechnya itself again is something entirely different, extremely risky and bloody. Among the general public, there were still vivid fears from the First Chechen War, which had already been extremely unpopular among ordinary citizens at the time. No one forgot how unprepared 18-year-old boys were sent into the New Year's assault on Grozny and how it ended. No one wanted a repeat of that nightmare. That's why, even in the media, the idea sometimes slipped through that we didn't need this rebellious Chechnya at all. And really, what good is this unprofitable republic, whose area is less than 1/1000th of all of Russia? Why were these sacrifices necessary? What was the point of all this? Subtitles? In short, under normal circumstances, the majority of Russia's population would have opposed a new war, and then forgave the throne for future Vladimir Tavrichesky. But the Chekists prepared for such a scenario in advance. They just needed to create an atmosphere of fear and hatred against Chechnya and the entire Chechen people, so that Russian citizens themselves would want to fight against the damn terrorists, and for this, terror in general was unleashed. And it should be noted here that provocations to incite or intensify hatred toward the enemy were used by Soviet special services before, for example, in the late 40s and early 50s. This is exactly how they fought against the Ukrainian insurgent army and the Forest Brothers. In the Baltic countries, Chekists often disguised themselves in enemy uniforms, carried out raids on civilians, set fires, killed, robbed, and raped. And then propaganda would trumpet about how savage those Banderites or Lithuanian nationalists were. And unfortunately, it worked. So the FSS gained nothing new. The country faced a wave of terrorist attacks with unprecedented casualties. On September 4th, a residential building exploded in Bunaksk. On September 9, an explosion occurred in a residential building on Guryanov Street in Moscow. On September 13, another apartment building was bombed on Kashirskoye Highway. And on September 16, a building was bombed in Volgodonsk. In just 2 weeks, the number of victims reached 307, an event unprecedented in Russian history. That's when things got truly terrifying. The country was seized by panic, driven by reports of Chechen militant atrocities. The economy was literally paralyzed by endless inspections of vehicles and residential buildings, and many people were afraid to go to sleep fearing their home might be next. Naturally, you could mold such a population into anything you wanted. Speaking of the Chechen connection, the authorities did not provide any convincing evidence that it was actually the Chechens who carried out these bombings. None at all, only references to some classified data and closed information. Not a single Chechen was caught at the scene of the crime, and none of the Chechen groups claimed responsibility for these terrorist attacks. Not even Shamil Basayev or the Arab mercenary nicknamed Khattab, who had a reputation as the most fanatical Wahhabis. Later, researchers opposed to Putin claimed that in the fall of 1999, the Chechens were the least interested in a new war with Russia, for which they were completely unprepared. They especially wanted to avoid further escalation of the internal political situation triggered by the terrorist attacks. On the contrary, it was important for the leadership of Ichkeria to secure the support of at least a few foreign countries, but the apartment bombings and the Second Chechen War completely destroyed their plans. However, no one voiced these arguments anymore, and over time, expressing them publicly became extremely dangerous for one's life and health. After that, everything followed the script. Authorities directly accused Chechnya of organizing the brutal terrorist attacks, then bombed Grozny and other Chechen cities. I wonder how they helped in the fight against terrorism. Then Putin, pretending to be a true fighter against Islamic radicalism, delivered his first famous phrase about wiping out terrorists in the toilet. And on September 30th, a full-scale ground invasion of Chechnya began, and not a single soul even uttered a word. Moreover, according to sociologists' surveys, 61% of respondents supported sending troops into Chechnya, whereas in August, their share was only 24%. That's how, in just 1 month, it was possible to turn the entire social structure upside down. Ryazansky sugar. But we might never have learned about all these Czechish tricks if they hadn't made one, but extremely important blunder. This failure happened right after the previous 4 explosions. To be precise, it was supposed to be the 5th, but this time God spared us. Imagine the scene on September 22, 1999 in the city of Ryazan, a residential area, the most typical 12-story building. Late in the evening after dark, he returns from work. An ordinary driver, Alexei Kartofelnikov, and near his entrance there are 3 suspicious guys, and they look Slavic, not Caucasian. They look like they're unloading some heavy sacks from a Zhiguli and carrying them into the basement. The car's license plates were covered up, and that immediately caught his attention. Plus, everyone suffered a loss. At that time, they warned everyone to pay special attention to people who showed interest in basements and semi-basement areas. So, after going back home, Kartofelnikov called the police. But, as always happens in the Russian provinces, the valiant law enforcement officers arrived 40 minutes late. During that time, the suspicious individuals vanished into Asha's thickets. The police officers who went down into the basement got a bit freaked out. Near the load-bearing wall, there were 3 huge bags, each weighing about 60 kilograms. The top bag was open, and inside was a white substance. The gas detector showed that it was Research Department explosive, a powerful explosive. Also in the bag, electronic clocks made to look like a pager were found, along with 3 batteries connected by wires. The device was set to go off at 5:30 in the morning. The detonator was a shell from a hunting cartridge filled with gunpowder. Of course, sappers were called to the scene. Residents of the building, who essentially got a second lease on life, were urgently evacuated. An urgent news was announced all over Russia that a new terrorist attack had been prevented in Ryazan. All the city's security forces were put on high alert. The interception plan was put into action, and all exits from Ryazan were blocked. At first, the authorities decided to go along with the version of a foiled terrorist attack, because Ryazan was only increasing panic among the population, and that completely suited Putin and his circle. But when the local security forces managed to track down the suspected terrorists and even began to detain them, an order suddenly came from Moscow to call it off. And Putin's right-hand man? Federal Security Service Director Patrushev publicly and radically changed the official version, saying that there was no prevented terrorist attack in Ryazan, and that everything that occurred was actually a special anti-terrorism drill, that the bags that were found didn't contain research department explosive, but just ordinary sugar. Such a twist is hard to imagine in a normal civilized country, but in Russia, anything is possible. By the way, here's a very curious fact. That vigilant Ryazan resident, Kartofelnikov, who noticed the sugar being planted, made a composite sketch of the 3 suspects in the terrorist act, and they were almost caught because of it. For 15 years, no one remembered him, until he suddenly resurfaced in Donbass in the summer of 2014. It turns out that one of those 3 guys looks a lot like our old acquaintance, the hero of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, Gherkin Strelkov, who, back in 1999, served in the Federal Security Service and was considered a master of various sabotage and provocations. In 2014, the Security Service of Ukraine intercepted his call with an accomplice. Gherkin suggested bombing a few apartment buildings in Donetsk and blaming the explosions on Ukrainian authorities. As you can see, experience from past years showed. All traces are covered. Of course, the story about the Ryazan sugar raised a huge number of questions, and that's not surprising at all, since the new official version was full of blunders and contradictions. There's no point in going over all of them. It's best to read the book Federal Security Service Blows Up Russia, or watch the film Assassination of Russia based on it. Lately, Russian authorities sometimes have it removed from YouTube, but concerned citizens continue re-uploading it. The authors of this study are the historian and public figure Yuri Felshtinsky, as well as the former Federal Security Service officer Alexander Litvinenko, who specialized in counter-terrorism and had numerous connections among Putin's circle. And here they present a number of facts that confirm the events in Ryazan were not exercises at all. For example, local telephone operator Nadezhda Yukhanova, told to monitor suspicious calls, recorded a conversation between Moscow and Ryazan where someone from Moscow told the other person to leave the city one by one. And, as it later turned out, the Moscow caller's number belonged to the central office of the Federal Security Service Checkmate. By the way, the fate of one of the authors of this study, Litvinenko, is quite unfortunate. Afraid of retribution from former colleagues, he fled to the United Kingdom and received political asylum. There, he actively criticized the policies of the Russian authorities and personally Putin himself. For this, in 2006, he was poisoned by Russian agents. Radioactive polonium was used as the poison, so images of the dying and bald Litvinenko spread around the world. The fate of another supporter, journalist Anna Politkovskaya, also ended tragically. She was one of the first in Russia to predict the transformation of Putin's regime into a real dictatorship. She criticized the tightening of the screws, the persecution of the free press and television, as well as the policy in occupied Chechnya and all the medieval lawlessness that the Kadyrov clan created there. And as a result, on October 7, 2006, on Putin's birthday, his henchmen would have given the boss a present. They shot this pesky journalist in the elevator of her own building, and not only her. They criticized the official version about the apartment bombings. For example, one of the oligarchs at the time, Vladimir Gusinsky, who owned the NTV channel, unlike other billionaires, did not support Putin's candidacy. And on March 24th, 2 days before the election, he organized a major investigation on his channel. A detective talk show called Independent Investigation, titled Ryazan Sugar Special Services Training or a Failed Explosion. This program became one of the most high-profile and talked-about shows on Russian television of that era. Residents of the Ryazan building and several high-ranking Federal Security Service officers were gathered in one studio. In the open discussion, the latter had to publicly justify themselves to citizens and defend their controversial version of the exercises. Ultimately, the security officers failed to persuade the residents and only increased their doubts. It's true that the Ryazan residents received several apologies, even from Patrushev himself, but no compensation was paid in the end. The criminal case was closed, and no one has seen the so-called sugar sacks again in modern Russia. In the age of zombie boxes, a program like this feels like pure science fiction. A quarter century later, it's hard to imagine that level of freedom of speech, assembly, and discussion in the country. The current authorities, especially the Federal Security Service, have long stopped interacting with the public, and they don't consider it necessary to be accountable for their own actions, even if those actions look like complete lawlessness or even terrible crimes. God save this Tsar, the golden heir to the Russian throne. Everything was turning out in the best possible way. In August 1999, the All-Russian Center for the Study of Public Opinion reported his approval rating at 31%. This figure is connected on the one hand with the fact that until Putin was appointed prime minister, almost no one knew anything about him. On the other hand, the factor of a fresh face played a role when, against the backdrop of Yeltsin's aging team, an unremarkable successor appeared. But in September, Putin's rating jumped to 53%. And why? Because Dagestan was cleared of militants, and the successor took all the credit for himself. In October, the approval rating was 65%, rising to 80% in November and 79% in December. Unprecedented numbers for Russia then. This is already a direct result of those infamous explosions. What happened was the so-called rally around the flag, or consolidation around the leader. During wartime, sociologists observed the besieged fortress effect. Enemies surround us, so we must stay together and trust our wise leader to save us. And notice, such a colossal rise in ratings in such a short period of time would have been absolutely unrealistic under normal circumstances. As the ancient Romans used to say, want to know who did it? Look at who benefits from it. Humanity hasn't come up with better wisdom yet. In January of the 2000s, Putin's approval rating hit 84%, then fell to 75% in February and 70% in March. The prolonged war in Chechnya had an impact, though Russian troops finally took Grozny on February 6th. The media presented this success as the greatest victory of valiant Russian arms since Stalingrad, although, frankly speaking, there was nothing to celebrate. During the Chechen wars, the capital of unrecognized Ichkeria changed hands 3 times. As a result of Putin's victory, Grozny was almost indistinguishable from Hiroshima. In August 1945, the city had to be rebuilt from scratch. But even a 70% approval rating was more than enough to silence any opponent. And everyone understood back then that there was no real alternative to Putin, and when he demonstratively refused to participate in the pre-election debates, the entire Russian political establishment took it for granted. The same situation occurred in all following elections. Putin never took part in any debates or other forms of dialogue that implied free competition. Instead, he used pre-arranged events, direct lines, large press conferences, and staged meetings with the public. And really, why are these debates even necessary? That's not a job for a czar. Let the boyars argue among themselves and try to prove something. The autocrat is always above all this filth. And finally, the long-awaited elections. Bam, 52% in the first round and no one even batted an eye, just as it should be. Operation Successor was a success, and on May 7th, the grand coronation took place. The one who, 2 decades later, would be nicknamed the Bunker Grandpa ascended the throne. And in Ukraine, well, you know yourself how we draw conclusions. Thus, the terrorist acts of September 1999 are Putin's greatest secret, because they call his legitimacy into question. It was precisely thanks to human blood that he managed to reach the heights of power without much competition. The apartment bombings justified starting the Second Chechen War. And in turn, it helped create the image of a strong and successful leader, a guarantor of stability, and a keeper of the great empire's tragic traditions. And this image, an absolutely false image, he continues to exploit to this day. Ultimately, you might think it would have been better if Putin just gave out buckwheat, but really, it would have been better if there was no Putin at all. And that's the absolute truth. Finally, when terrorist attacks happen in Russia, the Rise Up Vast Country mode will be activated immediately, with Putin or his successor. Remember this video.